All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We've been hearing it constantly for what feels like forever now surrounding the Russia-Ukraine war,
Yeah.
this constant call, this loop of ceasefire now. And
Yeah.
look, it's obviously coming from a good place, a humanitarian place, right? But diplomatically, it just feels so stuck. It sounds simple, sounds reasonable, but every time Western leaders, international bodies make that call,
So nothing.
exactly. It just fizzles. It signals maybe good intentions, but the fighting, the grinding reality on the ground, it continues.
And that futility, that diplomatic dead end,
Yeah.
that's exactly what the sources we've been digging into really try to explain. They argue pretty forcefully, actually, that these calls for peace, they're built on a foundation that's just fundamentally broken.
Broken how?
Well, you've got these demands for just stopping the shooting, a purely military thing, but they're totally disconnected from the geopolitical realities and maybe even more importantly, the economic realities that are actually, fueling the whole conflict.
Yeah.
It's kind of like trying to put out a huge bonfire by just blowing out the match you used to light it while the whole pile of wood is still blazing away. You haven't dealt with the fuel.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Our mission today for this deep dive is to really cut through that static, that noise. We want to analyze the core contradictions, the things that just don't add up in the current Western strategy for peace.
Right.
And then, based purely on the expert sources we've analyzed, lay out a different path, a comprehensive political roadmap, step by step, how you might actually get to some kind of lasting stability, because clearly just calling for a pause isn't cutting it.
And this leads us straight to the core argument, the main thesis, really, that comes out of this analysis. It's the idea that trying to make peace while, at the same time, pushing away or ignoring key neutral countries. Well, one source just called it absurd, flat out.
Absurd.
Yeah.
Strong word.
Yeah, but think about it with an analogy they used. The Middle East, Gaza, for instance. Can you imagine trying to broker a ceasefire there, a meaningful one? Well, basically treating Qatar, the one country that actually has lines open to both Hamas and Israel, as if they're irrelevant or even part of the problem.
No, it'd be impossible. It wouldn't even get off the ground.
Exactly, it would fail instantly. And the sources argue that the very same logic applies here to Ukraine. India, they position, is effectively the Qatar of Ukraine peace. It's the one major nation that seems to have the access, the trust, and frankly, the unique kind of leverage needed to bridge what's become this massive and honestly growing gap between Russia and the West.
And for you listening, understanding this whole dynamic, it's really crucial. This isn't just some abstract debate about security way over in Eurasia. The decisions being made right now, especially around things like sanctions and these frozen Russian assets we'll get into, they have direct consequences.
Huge consequences.
Yeah, for the future of global finance, for the stability of the US dollar, and they really could redefine what we even mean by a lasting peace in this messy, multipolar world we're living in. The insights here, they really do have global implications.
Okay, let's dive into that first big piece of the analysis then, the missing mediator. Why is the current setup, the current framework for peace talks, so fundamentally broken, according to these sources? They offer pretty scathing critique of Western diplomacy, pointing to this fatal flaw, this contradiction right at its core.
The core contradiction, it's actually pretty simple, and it's structural. The United States, the EU, they aren't neutral observers here. They just aren't. In Moscow's eyes, whether you agree with that view or not, they're seen as, well, combatants in a proxy war.
Because they're supplying weapons, intelligence, money.
Exactly. So when Washington or Brussels steps up and says, hey, let's mediate or come talk peace in our capital, Russia just sees that as a non-starter. It looks like the adversary trying to dictate the terms of surrender, just dressed up as diplomacy. It's like asking, the source materials use this analogy, right? Asking two sides that deeply distrust each other to just sit down alone without the UN, without some genuinely independent, trusted third party in the room.
Precisely. Asking Washington to mediate without someone credible and neutral involved is like asking, Netanyahu and Hamas to negotiate directly without Qatar or Egypt or the UN there. It stops being real diplomacy.
Right.
It just becomes
Theater.
That's the word they used. It might look good, play well for the domestic audience back home in the West, but strategically, for actually ending the conflict, it's basically useless.
And that theater, that performance, leads straight to this credibility gap you've seen stall any real progress for, almost a year now? Peace efforts just spin their wheels because the two sides aren't even speaking the same diplomatic language.
Totally different dialects. When Moscow hears ceasefire now, the sources argue it translates to them as raise the white flag. Especially, and this is key, when that call comes with zero guarantees, zero promise about eventually lifting sanctions, unfreezing those billions in assets, or addressing Russia's own stated long-term strategic worries about NATO or long-range missiles on its borders.
Right. And this is where we have to connect the dots between the military side and the economic side, isn't it? Because the sources we looked at, they're very explicit. This massive, unprecedented sanctions regime, it's not just a diplomatic tool. They define it as
Acts of economic warfare.
that's right.
Straight up.
Yeah.
The sheer scale of the financial pressure, the restrictions, it's designed to cripple the Russian economy. Full stop.
So if you accept that definition, that sanctions are basically financial attacks.
Then demanding a military ceasefire while keeping that financial chokehold fully clamped down,
Yeah.
it's perfectly like, yeah, offering a handshake with one hand while, holding a dagger behind your back with the other.
Makes sense.
The Russian thinking, the sources suggest, is pretty ruthlessly logical here. If the economic siege stays in place even after we stop fighting, what have we gained? We lose all our leverage on the battlefield. And for what? No long-term political win, no financial relief. Why would any country agree to basically disarm itself just to face an indefinite continuation of its economic strangulation?
So the only way forward, logically, has to involve a nation that isn't wielding either the military weapon or the economic weapon against them.
Exactly. And that nation, that potential pivot point, according to this analysis, is India.
Okay, let's dig into India's position then. The sources argue it's unique, giving it access, trust that basically nobody else has right now. We're talking the world's most populous democracy, a rising economic giant, but crucially, it's maintained this consistent policy of, what's the term they use?
Strategic autonomy.
Yeah.
And that autonomy, that's the real currency here for any potential peace effort. It means India acts based on what it sees as its national interest, not because of alliance pressure from Washington, not because of pressure from Moscow. It charts its own course.
And you see that in its affiliations, right?
Absolutely. Look at the memberships. India is a core member of BRICS, alongside Russia and China. But it's also a key member of the Quad-GLAC, the security dialogue with the U.S., Japan, and Australia. That's walking a very fine line.
And economically.
Well, it's buying huge amounts of discounted Russian oil. Russia's now India's #1 supplier, I believe, and its military. It's heavily dependent on Moscow. The sources cited a figure over 60% of India's major defense equipment. Think fighter jets, tanks, submarines, missile systems. It's Russian-made.
60%, that's a massive dependency. You can't just switch that off overnight, even if the West wanted them to.
No way. It shows a deep structural tie. But, and this is the crucial, but at the very same time, India is actively strengthening its strategic ties, its tech ties, its trade ties with the United States. It's becoming a vital economic partner for the West. And importantly, it has consistently provided humanitarian aid to Ukraine throughout the conflict.
So it's not just picking a side. It's this multi-directional diplomacy. It looks like fence-sitting to some, maybe, but the sources frame it more as strategic necessity, political skill.
I think that's fair. And this complex positioning, this ability to maintain serious relationships across these massive geopolitical divides, is what makes India, according to the analysis, potentially the only country that could realistically present a comprehensive peace package and have it taken seriously by everyone involved.
Everyone.
Meaning President Putin in Moscow, President Zelensky in Kiev. And this is really important for looking ahead, potentially even a future U.S. administration, whoever that might be, including someone like Donald Trump, who might just want a quick transactional end to the whole thing. India can talk frankly in all those capitals without being immediately dismissed as biased, because its policy has consistently been about its own interests and maintaining neutrality.
Okay, but there's always the counter argument, right? What about China? Beijing has close ties to Russia. It's a major global power. Why couldn't China play this mediation role?
Yeah, that comes up a lot. The sources we looked at pretty much dismiss that idea as wishful thinking.
Yeah.
Mostly rooted in, perhaps, Western desperation for any powerful actor to step in.
Why wishful thinking, though?
Because from Kyiv's perspective, and arguably from Washington's too, Beijing just isn't neutral. It's seen as fundamentally part of the war machine keeping Russia going. The evidence cited is pretty specific. Chinese semiconductors flowing into Russia, specialized vehicles, tons of industrial materials. These are critical for Moscow's military logistics, for keeping the war effort supplied.
So China's basically provided an economic lifeline that stopped the Russian industrial base from completely collapsing under Western sanctions.
That's the argument. China has propped them up economically. So asking China to mediate, it's kind of like asking a major arms supplier, or maybe the logistics company delivering the bullets, to broker a truce between its two biggest clients. It lacks moral credibility, certainly from Ukraine's side, and
Right.
probably from the West's too.
Whereas India,
India, by contrast, has maintained what the sources call a clean ledger. Unlike China, it hasn't been arming Russia. But crucially, it also hasn't imposed sanctions. It stayed out of the economic warfare piece, too.
so no entanglement on either the military or the economic front.
Right. And you combine that lack of direct entanglement with its established democratic credentials, its leadership role in the global south through things like the G20 presidency it held, its voice in BRICS, it allows India to come to the table without what some perceive as the maybe moral arrogance of the West or the sort of moral baggage that China now carries in this specific conflict.
Access plus trust, underpinned by genuine strategic autonomy.
That's the unique combination. And that, the sources argue, is India's indispensable currency if there's ever going to be a brokered peace.
But even if India steps up, even if it has that unique position, there's this massive financial landmine waiting, isn't there? This issue of the $300 billion. Roughly $300 billion in Russian central bank assets, sovereign assets, that are frozen in Western banks, mostly in Europe. And the ongoing talk, the proposals, especially in the EU, to actually seize this money and hand it over to Ukraine for reconstruction. The sources we read called this move geopolitical folly.
Yeah, folly is a good word for it. Based on their analysis, this is maybe the single most dangerous financial aspect of the whole conflict right now. Just freezing the assets, that was already a huge step, right? An extraordinary move. It basically declared that financial systems themselves could be used as weapons.
Weaponizing finance.
Exactly. But actually seizing them, confiscating sovereign reserves, that crosses a line, a really fundamental line that's basically underpinned the entire global financial order since World War II. This isn't just politics. The sources argue it's a profound breach of established international law.
Okay, let's dig into that legal breach, because the source material really emphasized this. Seizing sovereign reserves breaks this core principle. What was it called again?
State immunity. It's a cornerstone of international law. For listeners who aren't deep into international finance law, basically, state immunity means that the assets belonging to a sovereign country, especially its central bank reserves, which are held to manage its currency, stabilize its economy, they're immune. They can't be seized by foreign courts or by foreign government action.
It's like diplomatic immunity, but for a nation's core financial assets.
That's a pretty good way to think about it.
And
And breaching that principle, it fundamentally shakes confidence in all reserve currencies, not just the dollar or the euro. When the U.S. or the EU decides they can just take another country's central bank money, even if they argue it's for a good cause, like countermeasures against aggression, it sends a chilling message.
what message?
The message is, no country's assets are truly safe if they're held within Western financial systems. Not China's massive holdings of U.S. debt, not the Gulf states' sovereign wealth funds, not Brazil's reserves. Western lawyers might try to find clever legal justifications, cite obscure doctrines, but the sources are blunt. This breaks a decades-old rule that underpins global finance. It shatters trust.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate for a second, because this is where the tension really lies, right? What about the sheer moral pressure? Politically, how can Western leaders look at the devastation in Ukraine, the bombed cities, the hospitals, the human cost, and not argue for seizing the aggressor's money to pay for rebuilding? What's the strongest counter-argument the sources offered against that very powerful moral claim?
And that's the absolute core of the dilemma. You're trading immediate moral satisfaction for potentially catastrophic strategic chaos. The folks pushing for seizure, their argument is clear. This is justified reparations. Russia invaded, Russia destroyed, Russia forfeited its right to immunity through its actions. That $300 billion looks like the quickest, most ethically direct source of funds to help Ukraine rebuild.
Seems logical on the surface.
It does. But the sources unanimously argue that the long-term strategic cost of taking that step absolutely dwarfs the immediate moral or financial gain.
And what is that cost specifically? What's the fallout?
The number one immediate consequence, according to all the analysis, seizing these assets will pour gasoline on the de-dollarization trend. It will dramatically accelerate it.
How does that mechanism work?
It's straightforward logic. Think about countries like India, China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. They're all watching this unfold very, very closely. If the U.S. and the EU can just unilaterally grab sovereign reserves based on political decisions.
They realize their own reserves could be next if they fall out of favor.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So they don't just get encouraged, they feel pushed to diversify away from the dollar and the euro immediately. They have to speed up the creation of what the sources call parallel financial systems. That means new ways to trade, new payment networks, bilateral currency swap agreements, anything that bypasses Western control, bypasses the SWIFT messaging system.
And the practical result of speeding that up.
It directly weakens global demand for things like U.S. Treasury bonds, which are the absolute bedrock of the dollar's global dominance.
Yeah.
It pushes us faster towards a world with maybe two competing and likely less stable global financial systems. You'd have a Western bloc based on the dollar and euro, and maybe a BRICS Plus bloc trying to use gold or commodities or maybe even new digital currencies trying to operate outside of Western reach. It's a massive shift, potentially doing permanent damage to the financial architecture we've known for 70 years.
Wow. Okay, so accelerated de-dollarization is one major risk. What else? How would Russia likely respond if these assets were actually seized?
Yeah, the sources are very clear. Russia's response isn't going to be hiring more international lawyers to fight it in court for 10 years. That's not their playbook. It will be swift, it'll be nonlinear, it'll be asymmetric, hybrid retaliation.
Meaning, give us some examples.
We're talking immediate and likely severe actions. Things like major cyber warfare campaigns targeting Western financial institutions, maybe even the SWIFT network itself, serious energy manipulation suddenly disrupting critical gas supplies to Europe, or maybe nuclear fuel exports that some countries still rely on.
Okay.
And the most direct retaliation, immediate nationalization of all the Western corporate assets still operating inside Russia, or maybe even in allied countries. And there's a lot still there. One source estimated the value of those trapped Western corporate investments at potentially close to $280 billion.
So let me get this straight. The West seizes $300 billion of frozen Russian state assets.
And in return, Russia could potentially inflict trillions in damage through cyber attacks and market chaos, severely disrupt energy supplies, and seize $280 billion worth of Western private company assets.
Trading moral satisfaction for strategic chaos. That phrase really hits home now.
It really does seem to capture the potential trade-off, according to this analysis.
And there's an added layer of irony here, isn't there? Regarding the actual goal of helping Ukraine rebuild.
A stunning paradox, yeah. That $300 billion is desperately needed to rebuild Ukraine, no question. But confiscating it now basically guarantees two terrible outcomes. First, the act itself is so controversial globally, it poisons the well for getting other major players like China or the Gulf states to chip in for reconstruction. It makes it solely a Western burden.
So the West ends up footing the entire bill anyway, potentially.
Potentially a much larger share. And second, the sources argue that down the line, when some kind of peace deal is eventually reached and the lawyers finally have their day, the West will likely be forced by international courts or arbitration to pay that $300 billion back to Russia, probably with interest and certainly with immense political humiliation after having already destroyed its own legal precedent and alienated half the world.
So it's lose-lose in the long run. What, then, is the responsible alternative? How do you use these frozen assets effectively without triggering this global financial meltdown? The sources seem pretty united on this, arguing for
freeze, don't seize. That was the consistent recommendation. It's the path of using the assets conditionally as leverage, not as a political weapon to blow up the system.
how would that work practically?
The mechanism proposed is actually quite elegant, and it crucially respects that principle of state immunity. You place the frozen $300 billion into a special UN-supervised escrow fund. The principal amount, the $300 billion itself, remains legally Russian sovereign property. It's untouched. That maintains legal integrity.
Okay.
However, the interest generated by that massive sum, and we're talking billions of dollars a year, potentially that interest can be legally and immediately channeled to Ukraine for humanitarian aid, for immediate reconstruction needs. That's generally seen as permissible under international law doctrines like countermeasures.
So Ukraine gets substantial funds flowing quickly, but the principle isn't touched.
Exactly. And here's the leverage part. The release of the actual $300 billion principal is then explicitly and contractually tied to Russia's verified compliance with the terms of a future peace agreement. Things like confirmed troop withdrawals, meeting compensation requirements set out in the deal, adhering to buffer zones, whatever gets negotiated.
So the assets become this incredibly valuable bargaining chip, a high-stakes chess piece to ensure Moscow actually follows through on its commitments, rather than just a one-time destructive trophy grab that shatters the whole game board.
Precisely. It's about playing the long game. Strategic discipline, the sources argue, over short-term political desperation or moral outrage, however justified that outrage might feel.
Okay, this brings us logically into the next section, moving from analyzing the problems and the risks to looking at the concrete proposals for a solution. If the current approach is broken, if seizing assets is too dangerous, the question becomes, what does a workable, comprehensive peace plan actually look like? And crucially, one that India could realistically champion.
Right. And the core insight here, running through all the sources, is that you absolutely have to shift paradigms. You have to move away from thinking purely in military terms, gains and losses on the battlefield, and embrace a political solution paradigm.
Meaning peace isn't just about stopping the fighting?
Not at all.
Right.
A simple military ceasefire done in isolation is basically meaningless in the long run. It'll just collapse. The sources argue strongly for a comprehensive package deal, where concessions, guarantees, and timelines are all integrated across different spheres of the conflict.
And they talked about 3 synchronized ceasefires.
Yeah, that was a key concept. To make peace stick, you need 3 things to happen more or less simultaneously, reinforcing each other. 1, a military ceasefire, obviously stopping the shooting and shelling. 2, an economic ceasefire. This is about the sanctions and financial pressure. 3, an information ceasefire, tackling the propaganda war.
Okay, let's break down that economic ceasefire piece because that seems critical given our earlier discussion. It means what exactly?
It means a carefully staged, explicitly conditional suspension of some sanctions. The logic is, if the sanctions were imposed as acts of economic warfare, then relief from those sanctions must be used as a tool for building peace.
Not just lifting everything overnight.
Absolutely not. The argument is for targeted relief, tied directly to verified actions on the ground. For example, you could say that certain specific sanctions, maybe those hitting global food security or access to medicines or blocking certain essential financial channels needed for permitted trade, those get lifted only after the military ceasefire has demonstrably held and been verified by neutral monitors for a significant defined period, say 60 days or maybe 90 days.
So you're not rewarding Russia for the initial invasion?
No, you're explicitly rewarding restraint, as one source put it. You're creating tangible economic incentives for the pause in fighting to actually continue, to become embedded.
It perfectly integrates the political and economic tracks. The goal becomes making it structurally irrational, too costly for either side to just tear up the ceasefire and go back to full-scale war. Economic carrots tied to verified troop movements and monitoring.
Exactly. They become essential glue to hold the military pause together while the deeper political issues are negotiated.
And the information ceasefire.
That's about tackling the nonstop barrage of state-sponsored propaganda and hostile rhetoric from all sides. It means a mutual, verifiable agreement to de-escalate the information war, to dial down the demonization, to allow space for more rational discourse, and maybe, just maybe, some trust building. You have to freeze the hate machine too, essentially.
Synchronization is key. These 3 ceasefires ideally need to start together, creating a kind of virtuous cycle of de-escalation across the board.
That's the framework. And it sets the stage perfectly for the detailed 4-point peace plan that the sources propose, a plan rooted in political realism, acknowledging the core security interests of the major players and designed with geographic pragmatism in mind.
Okay, let's walk through it. Point 1 seems focused on immediate security on the ground.
Point 1, mutual ceasefire and creation of buffer zones. This is the immediate military stop. But it's more than just silence guns. It requires both Russian and Ukrainian forces to pull back a significant distance. The suggestion was at least 50 miles, maybe more, from all the current contested front lines.
Creating a genuine demilitarized zone.
A real DMZ, yes. And critically, this zone can't be left empty or monitored by biased parties. It must be overseen by credible, neutral UN peacekeeping forces. And the sources were specific here. These peacekeepers should ideally be drawn from neutral Global South nations. Think countries like India, Nepal, Brazil nations that carry the necessary non-aligned credibility that, frankly, European or NATO countries currently lack in Moscow's eyes, and perhaps vice versa.
Okay, step 1, stop shooting, pull back, neutral monitors, move in. What's step 2?
Point 2, refugee return and immediate reconstruction. This is about building confidence and addressing the humanitarian catastrophe. The key here is that reconstruction efforts should not wait for the final political settlement, which could take years. They need to begin almost immediately once the ceasefire holds.
A tangible peace dividend right away.
Exactly. And crucially, the funding for this initial reconstruction push must be a joint effort. It shouldn't just be the West footing the bill. The sources argue it needs to be visibly shared by all major global economic powers. The U.S., the EU, yes, but also China, and key Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Why is that joint funding so important?
Because it signals a shared economic future, as one analysis put it. It demonstrates global buy-in to the peace process itself. It makes the rebuilding less of a zero-sum game where one side feels it's paying for the other's victory. It internationalizes the recovery.
Point 3 gets into the really deep political stuff, doesn't it?
Point 3. Political reset within Ukraine. This tackles the long-term structural issues, the strategic grievances that arguably fueled the conflict in the first place and invited external meddling. The plan requires President Zelensky to take some politically tough steps, call fresh national elections, and perhaps even more significantly, initiate a constitutional referendum.
A referendum about?
About fundamentally transforming Ukraine's state structure into a federal system. This means amending the Constitution to grant genuine, substantial regional autonomy, guaranteed linguistic rights, and specific cultural protections to all of Ukraine's diverse regions, but particularly those in the east and south with large Russian-speaking populations or distinct historical identities.
Decentralizing power.
Significantly.
Yeah.
And as a core part of that constitutional reset, the clause enshrining Ukraine's ambition to join NATO, which Russia has consistently, for decades, called an existential threat, a red line that clause must be removed. This would effectively solidify Ukraine's long-term military neutrality.
Now, proponents of Ukrainian sovereignty would push back hard on that. They'd see federalization and removing the NATO clause as weakening the country, making it vulnerable.
And that's a valid concern. But the sources frame it differently. They argue this isn't about weakening sovereignty, it's about stabilizing it by addressing the core internal divisions and external security dilemmas that led to the war. It's about removing the primary structural catalyst for conflict through controlled decentralization and guaranteed neutrality. It makes Ukraine governable and less of a geopolitical flashpoint.
Okay, federalization and neutrality. Then there's the final point, which sounds maybe the most controversial of all.
Yeah, politically it's definitely the toughest sell, but the sources argue it's absolutely necessary for achieving long-term, durable legitimacy. Point 4. UN-supervised referendums in disputed territories.
Specifically where? In Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, and potentially in other contested regions in the Donbass in the south that are currently under Russian occupation. The argument is that within a defined time frame, say, 1 year after the ceasefire has verifiably held and stabilization has begun, you need to hold internationally supervised referendums in these specific areas.
Why? What's the principle here?
The core principle, stressed repeatedly in the source material, is that borders or political statuses that are imposed by force without the genuine consent of the people actually living there are inherently unstable. They just become seeds of future conflict waiting to sprout. So to achieve a peace that lasts, the people in these specific, highly contested territories must be given a clear, fair, internationally observed choice about their own future.
And what would the choices on the ballot be?
The proposal suggests 3 clear options. A, remain part of the newly restructured federal Ukraine with guaranteed autonomy. B, become an independent neutral statelet, perhaps with international security guarantees. C, formally join the Russian Federation.
Wow. And the outcome of these UN-run votes would be internationally recognized as the final word on the status of those territories.
That's the goal. It has to be seen by all sides and the international community as the ultimate legitimate arbiter of sovereignty for those specific disputed lands. It's about replacing rule by force with rule by consent, however difficult that process might be.
So just to recap the 4 points: mutual ceasefire and buffer zone with neutral peacekeepers, immediate internationally funded reconstruction and refugee return, a political reset in Ukraine towards federalism and neutrality via elections and a referendum, and finally, UN-supervised referendums in Crimea and other occupied territories offering choices on their final status.
That's the comprehensive package. It tries to synchronize the military pause with conditional economic incentives and deep structural political reform with, ultimately, popular consent in the most contested areas. And the argument is, this complex integrated approach is something only a truly neutral, trusted broker like India could potentially shepherd through with all the key players. It shifts the whole conversation away from just military victory or total defeat towards finding a durable, stable equilibrium.
Okay, but let's be realistic. That brings us squarely into the challenges of implementation, our 4th section: legitimacy at the front lines. It's one thing to sketch out referendums and federalization in a policy paper. It's a whole different universe trying to actually do it on the ground, in places scarred by war, displacement, and deep mistrust.
Absolutely. The sources are very clear on this. War doesn't just destroy buildings and infrastructure. It shatters trust, it fractures communities, and it fundamentally undermines the very idea of political legitimacy.
That principle you mentioned, borders imposed without consent being seeds of future conflict, it sounds right. But making consent meaningful in a post-war zone, that seems like the Mount Everest of diplomacy.
It really is. Referendums, they have this democratic appeal, right? Let the people decide. But in practice, especially right after a brutal conflict, they are incredibly fraught, packed with risks of manipulation, intimidation, and just flat-out violence.
What are some of the biggest practical and ethical hurdles the sources highlighted?
Well, the first one is just basic non-negotiable security. Voters have to feel safe, genuinely safe, free from coercion by local militias, by occupying forces, by returning fighters, by anyone. If that baseline security guarantee isn't absolutely ironclad and internationally verified, the results are dead on arrival. The losing side will immediately and probably rightly declare them illegitimate.
Okay, security first. What's next?
Maybe the thorniest issue of all, population movement and voter eligibility. War displaces millions. You have refugees who fled the country entirely, scattered across Europe. You have millions more internally displaced people, IDPs, who fled their homes but are still inside Ukraine. So who gets to vote in a referendum in, say, Donetsk?
Yeah, who? The people who happen to be living there right now, some of whom might have been moved in recently by occupying authorities.
Or is it the people who were registered as residents back in, say, 2013, before the conflict really erupted, many of whom are now living in Kyiv or Warsaw or Berlin? Or do you try to count everyone who ever lived there?
Defining who is an eligible voter sounds like it could completely predetermine the outcome.
It absolutely shapes it. If you only count current residents in Russian-occupied areas, the vote might heavily swing towards joining Russia. If you try to include all pre-war residents, many of whom are refugees who might lean strongly towards Ukraine, but you can't actually get them back safely or verify their identity easily, the whole process becomes incredibly complex and open to challenge. There's no easy answer.
And then there's the information battleground.
Exactly. After years, literally years, of intense weaponized propaganda, disinformation campaigns, state media control from both sides. How do you possibly ensure that voters are making a genuinely informed choice based on reliable facts?
Seems almost impossible.
It requires a massive, internationally funded and monitored effort in civic education. You need to guarantee access for independent media, counter the fire hose of falsehoods. It's a huge undertaking just to create a reasonably balanced information environment for people to make such a momentous decision.
And the timing. You mentioned timing earlier. When do you hold such a vote?
That's another critical sequencing dilemma. Hold it too early while tensions are still boiling, while maybe non-neutral security forces are still effectively in control on the ground. The result might just reflect the temporary reality of occupation or fear. But if you wait too long, delay it for years while trying to rebuild trust, the political window might close. New grievances might fester among people who feel stuck in limbo, disenfranchised. The momentum for a settlement could be lost.
So referendums aren't some magic bullet. They have to be the end point, the culmination of a much broader, carefully constructed political process that builds legitimacy along the way.
Precisely. They're not a one-off gimmick, as one source warned. They have to be meticulously planned and managed as part of creating a whole new, legitimate political architecture for these contested areas.
So to avoid these pitfalls, to make these incredibly sensitive votes credible, to meet what the sources called a gold standard for post-conflict referendums, what needs to be in place? What's the institutional checklist? This isn't just nice to haves, right? It's the bare minimum for the results to stick.
Absolutely minimum requirements for legitimacy and durability. First, on security. Those multinational UN or neutral peacekeepers we talked about, the Indians, Brazilians, Nepalis, etc., they need to be fully deployed, fully operational, and seen as impartial long before any polling stations open. And crucially, there needs to be verifiable disarmament and cantonment, meaning confinement to barracks of all irregular forces. Militias, foreign volunteer fighters, private military contractors, they have to be neutralized before people vote.
Okay, security foundation first, then the voter list.
The rules for voter eligibility have to be crystal clear, legally sound, and managed by an impartial body, probably with significant international oversight. You absolutely need an independent, ideally international mechanism to handle disputes over registration because there will be disputes. And critically, you need secure, internationally monitored, properly timetabled programs to allow refugees and IDPs who want to return to their homes to actually do so safely before the vote takes place. You can't disenfranchise huge chunks of the original population.
And transparency during the campaign and the vote itself?
Paramount. You need an electoral management body that includes both international experts and trusted local figures from different communities. You need guaranteed, open access for independent international election observers, NGOs, journalists. No restrictions. And the legal framework for the vote itself has to be agreed upon in advance.
Like what?
Like, exactly what threshold constitutes a valid outcome?
Yeah.
Is it a simple 50% plus one majority? Does it need a supermajority, say 60% or two-thirds, for such a major status change? What's the required minimum voter turnout for the result to be considered valid? All these rules need to be set beforehand, and you need an impartial, probably internationalized tribunal ready to adjudicate any post-election challenges quickly and fairly based on those pre-agreed rules.
It's an incredibly demanding list.
It is. But the alternative is a referendum process that nobody trusts, whose results just become another source of grievance and future conflict. If you're going to do it, you have to do it right, to this gold standard.
Okay, let's circle back to the other major political piece proposed in the roadmap, federalization. Transforming Ukraine itself into a federal state. Again, this is often seen purely as a concession to Russia or as weakening Ukraine, but the sources presented it differently, right? As a potential stabilizer.
Yeah, they framed it not as a punishment or as surrender of sovereignty, but as adopting a sophisticated, proven toolkit for managing diversity within a single state. Federalism isn't inherently weak. Look at stable, prosperous, diverse democracies like Canada, Switzerland, Germany, even India itself to some extent. They are federations precisely because deep linguistic, cultural, or historical diversity needs a structural framework to be governed peacefully. Suppressing diversity rarely works long-term.
So it's about building an architecture for coexistence.
Exactly. And the sources highlighted a couple of key design principles that would be crucial for making federalism work in a conflict-sensitive context like Ukraine. First is the idea of asymmetric federalism.
Asymmetric
Meaning not necessarily giving every single region the exact same set of powers or the same relationship with the central government in Kyiv. It acknowledges that different regions have different histories, different needs, different demographics. So a region in the east with a large Russian-speaking population might get specific, constitutionally guaranteed powers over language use, education, local policing, maybe even certain cross-border economic ties. A region in western Ukraine might have a different arrangement, perhaps retaining more centralized control in certain areas. It's about tailoring the economy to fit the specific context of each region.
Okay, so different deals for different regions. What was the second principle?
Fiscal federalism. This is absolutely critical for lowering the stakes of political conflict. It's all about money. It requires clear, transparent, predictable rules for how national revenues, taxes, resource income, etc. are shared between the central government and the regional authorities.
So local regions know they'll get their fair share, regardless of who's in power in the capital.
Precisely. If a region knows it has a guaranteed stream of funding based on an agreed formula, and that money can't just be turned off arbitrarily by politicians in Kyiv, the incentive to fight tooth and nail for control of the central government decreases dramatically. It takes the zero-sum nature out of controlling the national treasury.
Makes sense. It reduces the feeling that political loss means economic ruin for your region.
Exactly. And the overall ethical point driving this proposed restructuring both federalization and the referendums is clear.
Yeah.
The ultimate goal has to be giving people real choice over their governance and providing the constitutional protections, linguistic, cultural, local self-rule, that address the deep-seated historical grievances that have fueled separatism, insurgency, and ultimately this devastating war.
So federalism becomes a way to transform these potentially explosive political disputes
into more manageable, institutionalized negotiations. Disputes between the center and the regions can be handled through predictable political bargaining or maybe through constitutional courts rather than spilling out into violence.
And crucially, these political structures, the framework for federalism, the rules for referendums, they need to be largely designed and agreed upon before the final status votes happen.
Yes, that sequence is important. You build the legitimate container first, then you allow the democratic expression within that container. That's how you maximize the chance that the outcome produces durable peace and stability, not just a temporary pause before the next round of conflict. Legitimacy, built carefully and institutionally, is the only foundation that might actually last.
Okay. As we start to wrap up this deep dive, which has covered a huge amount of ground, Let's try to distill the key takeaways. What are the central interconnected findings that really emerged from this expert analysis of the war, the broken peace process, and this potential roadmap forward?
I think there are three core conclusions that stand out. First, and maybe most foundationally, is the unique, almost uncomfortable indispensability of India in this specific crisis. The analysis positions India as the essential pivot point for any viable multipolar diplomacy right now.
The only nation with the right mix of strategic autonomy, trust, and access.
Exactly. The only one seen as potentially capable of presenting a really comprehensive peace package and having it taken seriously in Moscow, in Kiev, and in Washington, regardless of who's in the White House.
Hmm.
The implication is stark. Sidelining India or trying to pressure it into abandoning its neutrality basically guarantees the peace process remains stalled and the war continues indefinitely.
Okay, India as the indispensable broker. Second key takeaway.
Second, the meticulous breakdown of the profound economic risks, the geopolitical folly of seizing those $300 billion in frozen Russian assets. The sources argue passionately that confiscation isn't justice in this context. It's a dangerous act of financial warfare,
One that risks violating core principles of international law.
triggering a dramatic acceleration of de-dollarization among crucial global players like China, the Gulf states, and India itself, and almost certainly inviting catastrophic asymmetric retaliation from Russia, cyber attacks, energy weaponization, seizing Western corporate assets.
So the responsible path, the smarter strategic move, is freeze, don't seize. Use the assets as leverage via a UN-supervised escrow fund, channeling the interest to Ukraine, but keeping the principle tied to peace compliance.
Precisely. Maintain the legal high ground and the diplomatic leverage.
And the third major finding.
Third is the absolute necessity of shifting from a purely military mindset to a synchronized, comprehensive political solution package. Peace can't be achieved through just a military ceasefire alone.
It needs those three simultaneous ceasefires. Military, economic, with that conditional, staged sanctions relief and information, dialing down the propaganda.
Yes. And that synchronized pause must create the space for deep structural political reform within Ukraine specifically, adopting federalism and constitutional neutrality, and then crucially, resolving the status of the most contested territories through internationally monitored referendums that grant legitimacy through the consent of the people living there.
It's a complex, interconnected package. No easy single solution.
No silver bullets here, only hard choices and complex trade-offs.
And this whole analysis, it really forces us to confront what seems like the core strategic choice facing the West, and perhaps the wider international community right now. It's a choice between two fundamentally different approaches.
That's right. Do they continue down the current path, which the sources effectively describe as clinging to an illusion of moral monopoly? That means demanding something close to unconditional surrender, maintaining maximum economic warfare through sanctions, and relying almost exclusively on military aid to achieve battlefield outcomes? Or do they pivot towards what the sources call the pragmatism of coexistence? That means accepting the need for a negotiated political settlement, one that inevitably involves difficult compromises and integrates security guarantees and concessions for all major parties involved, with the primary goal being long-term stability rather than total victory or moral vindication.
And the analysis strongly suggests that true, durable peace requires the latter path.
Unequivocally, it demands abandoning the fixation on punishment, however emotionally satisfying that might feel, and embracing the difficult, messy work of building a pathway towards reconciliation and a stable political settlement. The sources warn that every single day that fundamental choice is delayed just means more bloodshed, more dangerous geopolitical fragmentation, and deeper, potentially irreversible damage to the global financial and legal order.
Which leaves us with maybe one final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to chew on. India, as we've discussed, finds itself positioned as this reluctant kingmaker, as one analysis termed it. Global circumstances, history, its own careful diplomacy. They've drafted New Delhi into this pivotal and probably quite uncomfortable central role.
Yeah, it's not a position they necessarily sought out so publicly.
Right. So the big question hanging in the air now is, will India choose to remain the world's most sought-after neutral power, primarily focused on navigating the multipolar world to its own economic and strategic advantage? Or will it finally decide to fully embrace the immense burden and the historic opportunity of becoming what these sources suggest it could be? The world's indispensable peace broker for this conflict, actively shaping the future of Eurasian security, not through force of arms, but through the unique power of its access and trust. That's the decision India and the world may be facing.